I remember when they failed to qualify for the World Cup in 2018, it felt like this absolutely monumental moment. It felt like something that wasn't supposed to happen. It was the first time in 60 years they'd failed to qualify for a World Cup, the first one since 1958 they hadn't been to. We've gone from that position of it feeling like the exception that Italy would fail to qualify for a World Cup to this very real possibility that they could fail to qualify for the third time in a row. Amongst the Italian public, I think there's almost half an expectation that they will fail because there's now a whole generation in which that's what they've done, a whole generation of Italian footballers who haven't been to a World Cup. There's a real desire with Italy to compare and contrast constantly with their generation going from the end of the 80s into the 90s into the early 2000s. This Italy team is nowhere near the talent of the 2006 World Cup winners. They're nowhere near the talent of the team that went and completely fluffed it in South Korea before that, which I think was a much more talented group than the group who won the World Cup in 2006. We're not talking about a generation of Maldini, Nesta, Christian Vieri, Francesco Totti, Alessandro Del Piero. That's not and shouldn't be the bar for comparison anymore. I think there's no question that Italy has been underachieving on the international stage, I suppose you say for the last decade, except for when they won the Euros. And I think that Euros was a reminder that the talent was never quite as disastrously bad as people wanted to make out that it was. And I think that when you look at this specific qualifying campaign, there's a lot of detail to unpick about why they've wound up in a playoff. I think the first and strongest thing that needs to be said is they just happen to be in a qualifying group with an extraordinarily strong Norway. This is not just Erling Haaland's team. This is a team with a core of players playing all across Europe, some of them at other top clubs like Martin Odegaard, some of them perhaps who've been part of that incredible Bodo Glimt story as well. So there's a lot of reasons why Norway right now are perhaps not to be viewed as an underdog to Italy in that group. Part of the picture is because they came out of the last Euros having perhaps not been willing to make a difficult decision and part ways with Luciano Spalletti, who, despite being a very talented tactical manager, didn't seem to have a good grip on things at the end of the last Euros. And certainly the way he went out, spinning out really with that 3-0 loss to Norway in Norway. But I do think that in amongst it all, there have been some positive things that have happened. The Matteo Retegui and Moise Kean partnership up front has scored 9 goals in qualifying and have shown that there is, for the first time in a while, some real options up front for Italy. I think in defence, there's certainly less of the confidence and stability that there once was. I think that even with players like Bastoni, who's been good for Inter, who's played in Champions League finals, you don't look at him and think, well, that's a player on the same level of Chiellini, Bonucci. But he's also still much earlier in his career than those players were at the end of their careers when we think of them being at their pinnacle. So there's room for growth there. Federico Di Marco, who's having an astonishing season at left wing back for Inter. Again, 2 Champions League finals. There's a depth in defence. And then in midfield is perhaps the area where you look at and think these are all experienced players now who should be carrying this team. Barella, Tonali, who of course who went to Newcastle. I have questions about whether or not they are quite at the level that their reputations maybe you'd think they should be. You can't look at this group and say, these are nobodies. These are players who shouldn't expect to be qualifying for a World Cup. You can look at them and say, they're not 2002 Italy. But the expectation of a group of players who, again, include Champions League finalists, include players playing at top club level across Europe, I think has to be, this group is good enough to be at a World Cup, should be at a World Cup. But it feels like Italy as a whole haven't known under Spalletti who they're trying to be. I'd argue they still don't really know under Gennaro Gattuso. I think tactically Gattuso hasn't necessarily put a very fixed and firm imprint on the side. What he has done is pretty much what you would expect Gennaro Gattuso to do, which is come in talking a lot about passion, to talk a lot about energy, to talk about character and drive and motivation. I think it's too soon to give a verdict on it. In the end, he'll either qualify for the World Cup or he won't. And more or less either this next game or the next 2 games, if they do make it through the semi-final and go to the playoff final against either Wales or Bosnia, that's going to define the entire view on Gattuso and his leadership of Italy. It just comes down to these games.